Hi, folks. Nice to be back at my new studio in my new apartment. Good to be starting to make videos again. I wanted to talk today about race. I know that a lot of people are going to come out with a lot of names after this, and I hope that just people don't. I think the first thing that I want to say is, just calling somebody a racist because they go against the operative word is extremely toxic. I think that anybody who says that somebody is racist really needs to investigate why they're saying it and what they're talking about. It's just used to shut people down, and shutting people down is bad because shutting people down stems education and stems discourse. And I'm all about the civil discourse. So, a lot of people ask me whether or not I believe in systemic racism. Now, systemic racism is a very, very kludgy word. When I wrote Fighting God, I wrote specifically that you don't want to have words that have multiple meanings because people will say a whole bunch of different shit and say that it means the same thing. And people will make it seem like you're in agreement and use that against you. A good example of this is the word spirit, right? If somebody asks an atheist if they're spiritual, they might say yes, thinking that spiritual to the atheist means, awe, a sense of awe and wonder at the universe, where the person listening hears spiritual as something supernatural and therefore believes that the atheist believes in God because they're spiritual to some degree when the atheists haven't said that. I believe systemic racism is one of those things. And that's why I believe that systemic racism, as a phrase, it shouldn't be used. But it also needs to be questioned and identified before it can be solved. One of the things that I really don't like about the progressive movement, about the Black Lives Matter movement, is that none of their stuff is based in data. None of their stuff says, okay, we have this many incidents, we want to reduce that by X percent. What are we going to do to reduce that by X percent? How long will it take to reduce it by X percent? If it fails, who do we blame and how do we fix it? And if it succeeds, how do we expand the program? That's how you solve a systemic problem. That's how you solve a problem. The idea of systemic racism now allegedly comes in two parts, right? There's the racist and then there's the non-racist racism. The non-racist racism is the fact that you are white, or in my case, Ashkenazi Jewish, and you were born in this country, therefore you have privilege, therefore you're a function of a racist system, therefore you are racist. I really don't like being called racist when I'm just arguing a point. And calling me racist isn't going to stop me from arguing a point. Once upon a time, we had systemic racism. That systemic racism manifested itself as policies and procedures which forced people of color into marginalized situations. They weren't the only victims of it. There was systemic anti-Semitism as well. But the systemic racism, in the Jim Crow era was pronounced and real and harmful and damaging. And then all that was taken away. So we had this system. And let's say that we've got an economic system, and there's the rich and the poor, and there's a lot of people who are poor who are black because of that systemic racism. Okay, so we've got a system here, and there's systemic racism in the system holding down the black folk more than other people, more than white folk, and as a result, there's more black folk who are poor on the aggregate. And then we take away the racism. We take away the systemic racism. We took Jim Crow away. We put in the Civil Rights Act, and we filled. And so what does this system look like now? We took away all the systemic racism. We took away everything that was every policy that was holding down black people, and we replaced it with anti-racism. So in every aspect of our government right now, there are systemic anti-racism policies that are in effect. And again, according to Dr. Roland Fryer from Harvard, it's very effective. And it leads to black people being shot 27% less likely than white people in like-for-like situations. Dr. Fryer is an African-American Harvard professor, seems to be a really brilliant guy. And I'm not saying that because he agrees with my point. I'm saying that because I know research when I see it. I have a master's degree in an MBA in marketing, and I know good research when I see it. And I read his research. I read the report itself. So we've got this system that used to be racist, and it forced a whole bunch of people of color, into the lower echelon. And then we took the racism away and we replaced it with systemic anti-racism, which is everywhere and it works. And when I explained this to Arian Foster, he said that this is still a systemically racist system, because there's still inequity. That inequity itself implies systemic racism. So if I had this system, if I could look at this system where everybody is adjusted, and I could just wave a magic wand and remove all of the systemic racism, but didn't move people around economically, well, I couldn't, because the systemic racism is a function of the effect of systemic racism. So do you see this, how this kludges? Systemic racism is the effect of systemic racism. But after you take away the systemic racism, there's nothing making that effect anymore. It's just the effect. And so when we're looking at this system, so Arian Foster and many, many other people, I'm just calling him out because he's a good example, thinks that this is still a systemically racist system, and it will stay that way for generations. Even after I've waved my magic wand and removed all the racism, even if I removed all the racism from the people in the system, that still would not make it a systemically anti-racist system, because there's still racial inequity. That's not a thing, okay? That's something that I strongly disagree with. I think that you're trying to really victimize people of color. That's the racism of lower expectations, and it's the racism that they can't compete on a fair level. We took all of the impediments away. If you are poor and black, there is nothing stopping you from succeeding more than there is something from stopping a poor white person or a poor Latino person. That's just true. If you're poor and black, there's nothing you can't do that a poor white person or poor Latino person can't do. Nothing. In fact, there are lots of systemic anti-racist systems that promote black children specifically and people of color specifically. So there's nothing stopping poor people based on race. So if there's nothing stopping poor people based on race, we are doing those poor people a disservice by concentrating on race. We are doing those poor people a disservice by saying we have a racist system, and you're a racist, and you're a racist, and you're a racist, and look at all these poor people. They're poor because you're racist. No. They're poor because the system was racist before us. They're poor because of a bunch of other reasons, including their own culture and their own behavior, and their parents' culture and their parents' behavior. To call it all based on racism is ridiculous. I want to talk a little bit about that. You know, when I did a video about the gender pay gap a while back, and in that I talked about how the gender pay gap exists for good and bad reasons. Okay, if you've got a gender pay gap, and let's say it's 80%, right? But you're looking at it, but that's when you're not taking in all the considerations, right? Let's just say that the 80% pay gap is still existent, which it really isn't, because a lot of that pay gap, in fact, just about all of that pay gap, is not due to misogyny. The problem with the pay gap is not the existence of the pay gap. The problem with the pay gap is the portion of the pay gap that is caused by bigotry. The rest of it is caused by women making choices in a free society of their own free will. Those may be choices you may not like, but that's your problem. If you don't like the choices that women make, if you don't like that women by and large choose the softer sciences and make less money, that's your problem. If women are making these choices of free will, if women are choosing to stay home more, that's great. That's freedom. The only problem is when women are forced to make choices because of bigotry, or when they get lower salary because of bigotry, because of misogyny, because of male chauvinism, because of the glass ceiling, and the portion the portion of the pay gap that is due to misogyny is minuscule, to the point where it's not even worthy of looking at. So bring this back to systemic racism. Bring this back to the progress of the African American community. When I talk about the African American community, I want to make sure that I'm speaking specifically about the African American community and not the black race. People from other countries, people from other continents, Africa, who come here, black people who come here from other countries, do not have the same problems that African Americans do. So when we speak about this issue, we have to talk about the African American community specifically. When you look at why they're not progressing, a lot of people will say, look at all those black people in the poor section. That's racism. That's inequity. And that's racism. That's white oppression right there. And you could have said something like that in the 1960s. But since then, things have changed. And all those restrictions have been lifted. And lots of provisions have been put in to fix it. Yet still the African American community is not thriving. It's not thriving in colleges. It's not thriving in the workforce. It's not thriving as far as income is concerned. Is all of that leftover bigotry? Is all of that white oppression? No, it's not. They say it is, that the lack of success in the black community, the lack of success in the African American community is allegedly due mainly to white oppression. It's mainly due to systemic racism. But there are so many other factors involved. Just like the gender pay gap, there are so many other issues involved. The problem with the lack of equity that is due to racism is, in my opinion, my problem. Okay, as a person of whiteness, a person of privilege in this country, the portion that is systemic racism, the real systemic racism that is holding down black people, is my problem. Because I'm a good person and because I'm a part of this community, I'm a taxpayer. But what part of the problem is it? Nobody is talking about it. People are coddling the African American community. It's almost as if we're afraid to say no to them. We're afraid to call them on their shit. I mean, the idea that you can't tell a black person that a black person doesn't need to hear from you if you're white on racial issues is just asinine, because I don't know if you know this, but black people are just as capable as white people as being completely full of shit. They can be completely wrong. They can talk out of their ass. They can be wrong. And here's the thing, folks. They can be wrong and I can be right on racial issues. Yes, they can. They can be wrong. If they say to me that the main problem hurting the African American community in America is systemic racism, they're wrong. And I'll go to them and I'll say, well, what about your anti-education bias in your community? What about your anti-marriage bias in your community? What about your education is white bias in your community? What about your anti-law and order bias in your community? What about, I can push off a whole bunch of things that are really hurting the black community unquestioningly. All of this has way more of an issue than the stuff that we're being told is white oppression. For instance, we're told that that officer-involved deaths of black people is a major force, a major cause of death in the African American community. The LA Times made this piece that said, death by cop is a major force in African American communities. And then they showed the chart. Chart clearly shows that death by cop is 6th or 7th in line, and it is 1/30th the size of black on black violence. Black on black violence, 0% white oppression, 0% racism, right? So it's 0% my fault and 0% my problem. You can't look at me and say, Dave, this black on black violence is your problem. No, no, the black on black violence is 100% the problem of the African American community. I care. I'm here to help. I want to help, but it's not my problem. And so when people say, well, this is about Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter is about black lives, well, no, it's not whataboutism to say, hey, look, these are actually your problems. Okay? Black on black violence is actually your problem. Okay? I'm here to help, but to say that we need to focus on police brutality instead of black on black violence, I mean, we're not going to fix the problem. And this is the problem that I have with Black Lives Matter. Because we have problems. We as a nation have a problem in our black communities, in our African American communities. There's a huge crime rate. It's not about the cops who are taking the felons off the road. I don't care about the felons. I've made many videos and comments before. I don't care about felons committing crimes. I care about innocence. Okay? I care about children. I care about those. Those are the black lives which matter to me. Okay? And we need to protect them, and we as a society need to protect them. And if we're going to just pretend that that's not the issue, those children and those innocents are going to die. And I don't want children and innocents to die. I think it's our job to protect them. And we're not doing it. As far as I'm concerned, as a white ally, as a white person, I'm doing nothing. I'm being asked to do nothing. I'm seeing nothing about fixing the black on black violence, which again is 30 times worse than cop on black violence. Black on black violence is 30 times worse. It's the number one killer of black people 18 to 45. And I don't see anybody doing anything about it as a white guy. Who's doing something? I don't know. Am I crazy? Is there a whole big nonprofit organization out there that's stemming black on black violence that I don't know about? Is there a nonprofit organization out there that says, hey, that's there to push the values of education in the young? Is there any nonprofit organization saying education, yes, on big billboards? We need to do that. We need to help fix the African American community by fixing the actual problems in the African American community, by recognizing that these people are our partners. We are all equal citizens on this planet and in this country, and we are all equal partners. But that means sometimes you have to call your partners on their shit. Sometimes your partner is full of shit. Sometimes your partner needs to be sat down and said no, and told, no, the problem is not that the police are beating up your criminals. The problem is your criminals. And there's a lot of them, and we need to fix it. And I also want to mention there's a lot of black suicide. And I want to help them too. And I don't know if there's anything that stops a nonprofit that helps with black suicide, but I want to support them. This is how we help the black community. It's not about defunding the police. Defunding the police is the most asinine idea. And it is one of the main reasons I left the Democratic Party and did not vote blue, because I think that defunding the police is an assault against the African American community, quite frankly. So thank you so much for checking me out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share the video, hit the bell, and I'll see you next time.